Plenty of issues keeping our next guest busy. Issues that affect your bottom line and how governments are putting your tax dollars to work. Franco Terrazano is federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He's also author of a new book. It's called Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax, out now from Sutherland House Books. Franco, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Hey, Rob. Happy to be on. Should be fun.
Let's start with, I guess, what appears to be a tax cut forthcoming from the federal government. Tuesday's speech from the throne reiterated the commitment for what the government calls this middle-class tax cut. Now, I guess things may be going in the right direction, better than taxes going up, but how significant is this, and how confident should we be that this is going to happen?
Well, I think it's a pretty good first step, right? So we're talking about savings of about $800 a year for, your two income earning family. So $800, like that is some good savings. I would say it's a good first step. You're saving taxpayers about $6 billion in total a year, according to some PBO numbers. We're going to have to see exactly what happens when we do get a budget from the government, right? We first heard from the Carney government that there would be no budget. Then there was some backtracking saying we would get some in the fall. So we're going to have to really see what happens and what the numbers look like in that budget. But, Rob, I would say that for years, we have seen taxes go up from the federal government. So it is a nice first step to get at least a 1 percentage point cut in the income tax rate. But I don't think it goes far enough. A good first step.
Yeah, and as you alluded to, I mean, we'll get a budget in the fall, perhaps. So I assume then this is something that is going to be passed through separate legislation this session. Maybe it ends up getting delayed till the fall. Do we understand how and when this is going to be implemented yet?
Well, we've heard from the Carney government that they're going to try to get it through before the House rises for the summer, right? The date that we keep hearing is before Canada Day. So, I think that would be welcome news for Canadians, but it all remains to be seen. We still have a minority parliament, so the Carney government's going to have to get, at least one other dance partner to support this legislation.
Well, and the whole question with the budget, like this would be one element normally of a budget. What about overall federal spending? What about taxes elsewhere? I guess we're going to assess how good this is for Canadians. We need to know the full context of what this government has in store, don't we?
Yeah, Rob, I'm so glad you brought that up, right? Because there's many reasons for Canadians to be worried about the state of our national finances, right? Over the last 9-10 years, we've seen the federal government double the national debt. Interest charges on the debt are now blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week, which is essentially the cost of building a brand new hospital that isn't getting built every week because of interest payments. And this is why it's so important for the government to be quick with a budget to essentially both give Canadians an idea of where the national finances stand at before members of parliament vote on spending and tax measures, but also for the members of parliament themselves, right? They're supposed to be our elected representatives. Well, it's pretty difficult for MPs to vote in an informed manner when they don't have a clear picture of exactly where the state of our finances are.
And by the way, speaking of elected MPs or those who were not elected in the last election, quite a turnover, more than 100 now former MPs, including, of course, now former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, out with some new numbers just this past week here. How much are we spending in order to send these folks off into the next steps of their lives or careers here in terms of severance and pensions? Some pretty big numbers.
Yeah, I always say don't feel too bad for the former members of parliament who don't get reelected because they're getting a pretty big time taxpayer send off, right? If you look at the pensions for those former members of parliament, they're going to total about $5 million this year alone, about $187 million in pensions over their lifetimes. And, if an MP doesn't serve 6 years, they're eligible for a taxpayer funded severance of about $105,000. Now, Rob, there's a couple things that come to mind, but I'll just give you some highlights right away. Okay, so there are 13 former members of parliament that will be leaving with an annual pension of more than $100,000. That's a big time pension. There are 3 former MPs who did not serve for an entire year and are still leaving with a severance of about $105,000. That's crazy. And here's the last point that really stuck out to me is that prime ministers walk away with 2 pensions, an MP pension, but then also a prime minister's pension on top of it. And, the value of these pensions is going to be in the millions of dollars for someone like former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Right, and I don't know that you can base it on one's wealth or bottom line, but it just we know the Trudeau family's wealth and what Justin Trudeau already has at his disposal, and I think for people struggling to get by, the idea that we're going to throw millions more at him after the millions, I guess as decade as prime minister in salary already sent his way, that might be tough for some people to swallow.
Oh, of course. I mean, look, a prime minister's salary while they're in office is already more than 400 grand, right? Every single year they get a pay raise on April 1. So the prime minister's current salaries is just shy of 420,000 bucks. And then as they leave office, a prime minister, they get an MP pension and a prime minister's pension. Okay. So Trudeau's MP pension will start at about $141,000 a year. It'll total about $6.5 million over his lifetime. But then there's the prime minister's pension on top of all that. So for Trudeau, that will start at about 73 grand a year, total about $1.9 million over his lifetime. So you add Trudeau's MP pension on top, add it to his prime minister's pension, and you're looking at total pension payouts for Mr. Trudeau at about $8.4 million over his lifetime.
Wow. What is reasonable, though, if we look at the example just of someone who's an MP, someone who steps away from a job and doesn't intend to be an MP for life, so they'll serve 4, maybe 8 years, they're going to quit their job. I mean, they will be well paid while they're in Ottawa, but if they're prepared to walk away, try to get back into private life, what kind of transition should there be, if any?
Well, I think it's gotten completely out of hand. Now, to be fair, there were some reforms in the Harper era, right? In 2012, there were some reforms which increased the contributions. So it's close to 50-50 between MPs and taxpayers now, but then taxpayers also fund the interest every single year. So there have been some reforms, but let's talk about one easy reform that should take place, and that's ending the prime minister's second pension. Right. I mean, they're already going to be getting millions of dollars through their first pension. They already get a very large salary while they're in office. I don't see any reason why taxpayers should be footing the bill for a second pension for a prime minister. Look, and then not only is there pensions, there's also this severance. And let me go back to the point I made very early, where there are 3 former members of parliament who did not serve for a year. Right? They got in with the by-election. They didn't even serve for a full year, and they're walking away with $105,000 severance. To me, that's crazy. To me, that should never happen. But then finally, I think there's an important question that we should ask. And Rob, we've had a lot of conversations before. I know you're very well versed with Alberta politics. Well, Alberta MLAs, they haven't had pensions for close to 3 decades now. Right. I think there is a legitimate question when you have less than a quarter of private sector workers being covered by a workplace pension. Well, why should MPs who already have a base salary north of 200 grand be entitled to a taxpayer funded pension when all they have to do is serve in that role for 6 years?
Yeah. Let's turn to the book, Franco. It's called Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. It's interesting, too. I mean, you look at the decision to scrap the consumer carbon tax, also the decision to back off on the capital gains tax changes and the tax out we talked about earlier. I mean, just kind of big picture, is there a shift in the public mood that maybe the government is sensing where there's kind of a backlash against these taxes that have been piling up over the last decade?
Oh, I think there's no doubt about it. And there's a couple reasons why. So number one, we did see inflation, reach a 40-year high back in 2022. And while the inflation rate might be going down, prices are still going up, right? You're still seeing prices go up on many different necessities. So during this whole inflation time, there were many provinces, including Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, Newfoundland and Labrador, Ontario, of all political stripes, that were cutting taxes, offering fuel tax relief. But during that very tough time for Canadians, you still saw the Trudeau government in Ottawa continue to raise carbon taxes year after year after year. So clearly Canadians were able to look around to the provinces, then look at Ottawa and see that the federal government was extremely tone deaf to the struggles facing, so many people on very important necessities. So that's one issue. But another issue is that we've seen a rising tax burden not just the carbon tax, but payroll taxes have been going up. Alcohol taxes have been going up. The government tried to impose a capital gains tax, imposed digital services taxes, online streaming taxes, a number of taxes. And yet services aren't improving at the same rate that government spending and taxes are going up, right? The bureaucracy, the cost has gone up 73% in a decade. Services haven't improved anywhere near that. So I just think Canadians were tapped out, fed up with a government that seems to only want to increase taxes and waste money. And I think that's why you saw some of the public backlash towards the federal government in recent years.
What was it about the carbon tax in particular, though, do you think?
Oh, the carbon tax in particular, I mean, it touches the necessities of life, right? It makes it more expensive for you to fuel up your car to get to work or to take the kids to soccer practice. It makes it more expensive for you to keep the heat on during the winter. And what really sparked fury in particular to home heating is when the Trudeau government also took the carbon tax off of furnace oil for 3 years, right? A clearly political move that really benefited the Liberal stronghold of Atlantic Canada, but then left essentially everyone in the rest of the provinces continuing to pay the carbon tax. So one of the biggest backlashes against the carbon tax is just that it makes the necessities of life more expensive, and it increasingly did so year after year after year.
Yeah, that was a real turning point, I think, because the government message had been up until that point, because of the rebates, you're almost better off with the carbon tax. And if that logic stood, then why would you exempt home heating? They're making two contradictory points. I think that really changed the debate and the conversation, didn't it?
Oh, I couldn't agree more than that, right? Because you had Trudeau surrounded by his Liberal MPs from Atlantic Canada, and the podium in front of Trudeau had something to the effect of making life more affordable.
Right.
Well, if Trudeau is making life more affordable by removing the carbon tax, then clearly the carbon tax was costing Canadians a lot of money. And when Trudeau did that, I think it became very obvious that his favorite talking point was gone, that nobody believed it, but also just the pure political rank regional favoritism that was at play. And Rob, as we transfer this conversation to the industrial carbon tax, there's going to be some more regional tensions here between the federal government and the provinces, because for years, the Trudeau government let the Quebec government impose a carbon tax rate that was lower than the rest of Canada. And now that the Alberta government has said that they won't increase the industrial carbon tax anymore, and that the Saskatchewan government has removed the industrial carbon tax, the question becomes, well, what does Carney do? Is Carney going to then go fight with the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan over the industrial carbon tax?
Well, yeah, and I mean, the details matter. Alberta was the first to bring in an industrial carbon pricing system, but in terms of the rates and compliance and what it all means to business and by extension consumers, I mean, like I say, the details do matter. So where are we at right now in terms of the kind of impact this is having or could have in the years ahead?
Well, where we are right now is that just before the election, the Carney government set the consumer carbon tax rate to zero. Right? And cabinet has the ability to do that. But what cabinet doesn't have the ability to do by itself is to fully repeal that piece of the legislation. So the carbon tax law is still on the books, which technically means that members of parliament or cabinet can then increase the carbon tax again. Now, Carney has said he wouldn't do that, that they would repeal the legislation. Well, we're going to hold them accountable and live up on that promise. Now, where I think the fight is going next is on this industrial carbon tax, right? The carbon tax that applies directly to businesses like oil and gas companies, fertilizer plants, steel manufacturers, things of that nature. And where it becomes interesting is to remember what's going on with the United States, right? We know that, there's this huge tensions between us and the US. Well, one of the issues here is that, of course, the United States government doesn't impose carbon taxes, doesn't impose industrial carbon taxes. And there's this big concern that an industrial carbon tax from Ottawa, especially with the times that we're living in, is going to push manufacturing away from Canada and into the United States. And I know some of the unions in Southern Ontario are already sounding the alarm over that concern.
So is it about right now, we're kind of having to prioritize competitiveness versus emissions policy or environmental policy, or is there a better way to try to balance the two?
Well, I do think that we have to focus on competitiveness right now in Canada. Right? I mean, look, like we're not emissions are not going to be reduced at all if businesses just set up shop south of the border. And I mean, you have a clear tension between what's going on in the US and what's happening in Canada. I will say though, I do think we have to take a very big picture look at making Canada more competitive, right? Like we do have to get major natural resource projects built in Canada. We've seen hundreds of billions of dollars in major resource projects stalled or canceled since 2015. Of course, everyone these days is talking about cutting internal trade barriers. I think that's obviously a good step, but we also have to look at the broader tax system, right? If you look at income taxes in Canada, we're ranked 31st out of 38 OECD countries on income tax competitiveness. Like that's really bad. That's pretty much bottom of the basement. On business taxes, we're ranked 26th out of 38. On both measures, the US is more competitive than Canada. So, to bring it back to the earlier part of the conversation on Carney's income tax cut, it's a good step. But clearly, if we want to focus on competitiveness, on job growth, on creating a good economy here in Canada, we have to do much more.
And investment in Canada, especially, right? I mean, I think we often hear we talk about, strengthening the economy. It's often about what role government's going to play or how much government is going to spend, as opposed to how do we encourage investment here, spur economic growth here, businesses to expand here. You can't really have that conversation without talking about the tax system, can you?
No, you can't. You really can't. And you also can't have that conversation without talking about, to your point, how much government is spending and what the debt is, right? Because also more government debt also creates investor uncertainty. Debt today essentially means taxes tomorrow unless governments cut spending. And we've seen massive debt accumulation in Ottawa. I mean, in some of the provinces as well, but especially by the federal government. And, one of the things that was talked about at the end of the election was the additional debt that Mr. Carney was running on. Now, to be fair, Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives, they weren't planning on balancing the budget. They were planning on adding more debt too. But Mr. Carney in his platform was proposing to add about $225 billion to the debt over the next 4 years, which surprisingly enough was about $100 billion more than even what Trudeau was planning to add to the debt over that same time.
Well, much more on all of this is mentioned, taxpayer.com. And of course, the book is out now. It's called Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. Franco Terrazano, thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Really appreciate the conversation.
Hey, that was fun. Thank you.